a second, right? So today we are starting off with Unit 5 of A2 Economics, which is inter-government macroeconomic intervention, right? And interconnectedness of macroeconomic policies or macroeconomic problems, right? Okay, now think about this. What is this unit about? Let me give you a little bit of an overview, right? And then we'll discuss each one of these points one by one, right? So apparently these look like a lot of points, but each of these points is quite simple, right? So what we're discussing over here is interrelatedness of macroeconomic problems, right? Now think about this. We know that there are five main macroeconomic issues that a country wants to focus on, right? Let me write these down um, for you, right? So macroeconomic variables, right? Now, these are variables which are not related to one market or one sector, but instead they are related to the um, entire economy, right? And that is why we call these macroeconomic variables, right? So the first one that we studied in AS, right? So this is just a recap of AS at the moment, right? So the first one that we studied in AS was GDP. One of them is GDP, gross domestic product, which we discussed in A2 as well. How to calculate GDP, what are different forms of GDP, gross national product, and net domestic product and net national product, and all these things, right? That we discussed, right? Then another variable that we talked about in AS was inflation, right? What is inflation? The rate at which the prices are increasing in an economy, how fast or how low is the rate of increase in prices, right? That's inflation. Then we also talked about exchange rate, which is about the value of one currency in terms of another. And in today's class, we'll be talking a lot about exchange rate and how it is related to other macroeconomic variables. And then you have balance of payment, right? So balance of payment is a document that records all exports and imports of an economy, right? So how many exports you made during a certain time period and how many imports you made. Um, so this is what balance of payment records. And then you have inflation, exchange rate, and the fifth one that we just discussed in one of our previous classes recently is unemployment. Like how many people are out of unemployment, are unemployed, what are the reasons and for their unemployment, and what can the government do to control that, right? So these are the five main macroeconomic variables, and that is what we'll discuss, right? Now, talking about interconnectedness of macroeconomic problems. So before we even jump to this, um, uh, right, let's talk about interrelatedness of macroeconomic policies problems, right? Let's talk about that. What does it even mean for macroeconomic problems to be interrelated, right? Now, the idea is fairly simple, and that is that if one of these variables is changing, how is that going to affect the value or the outcome for the other variable, right? So one of these variables, yes, I'll be writing all of this down. Don't worry, right now I'm just explaining you, I'll be writing, I know, right? I have that document open with me, right? Now, interrelatedness of macroeconomic problems is that how due to change in one of these variables cause a change in, another variable, right? So for instance, in today's class, we'll talk about the first topic that we'll talk about is relationship between internal and external value of currency, right? So what's the relationship between internal and external value of currency? That's the first thing that we'll talk about. Relationship between internal and external value of currency, right? Now we know that internal value, as we'll discuss, internal and external value of currency, right? Now the internal value of currency is basically how much is the purchasing power of a currency within a country, right? So what is internal value of currency? I'll write all of this down, but for now, I just want you to focus on what I'm saying. Internal value of currency is basically the purchasing power of a currency in terms of local goods and services. So how many goods and services can can the currency buy is internal value, right? And what is external value? External value of currency, as we'll discuss, is your exchange rate, right? how many units of foreign currency can 1 unit of your currency buy, right? That's your exchange rate, right? And that's the first thing that we're about to discuss, right? So let's write down the definitions and all that, right? So have a look at this. So we will, first of all, so we are starting off with this new document, right? Which is only for unit 5, right? And if you want to, I'll arrange these resources as well, so you don't need to worry, right? Interrelatedness of macroeconomic policies. In fact, a better word would be macroeconomic problems. Okay. Now, macroeconomic variables are the ones that are related to entire economic variables that are sector, right? So that's the first thing that you need to know, that what's the distinction between macro and micro economic variables, right? So that's the first thing, right? Okay. Macroeconomic variables are the ones that are related to the entire economy, unlike microeconomic variables that are related to one particular industry or sector. Following, so I mean, while we are doing new parts, while we are discussing new topics within this unit, we will also do some recap of what we already know in the AS, because until unless we do the recap of the topics that we have studied in AS, we will not be able to really build on the new topics, right, that are part of our A2 syllabus. So what we are doing at the moment, that is a little bit of recapping what we already know through our AS, right? Following the list of macroeconomic variables, right, and that includes GDP, inflation, exchange rate, unemployment, and balance of, right? Okay, now think about this. Interrelatedness of macroeconomic problems refers to issue refers to the idea that any change in one macroeconomic variable to change in another variable. Therefore, the two variables could be interrelated to. Now have a look at this. What does it say over here? Interrelatedness of macroeconomic problems refers to the idea that any change in one macroeconomic variable can lead to a change in another macroeconomic variable, and therefore the two variables could be interrelated to each other, right? Is making sense? So for instance, change in exchange rate result in change in of a country, therefore macroeconomic policy countries should be mindful of this relationship, right? Is making sense? Okay, have a look at this. Now, to better understand that, what do we mean by interrelatedness of macroeconomic problems? And that is that, for instance, if, which is there one, if there is a relationship between exchange rate value of a country and its balance of payments, then therefore the macroeconomic policy that the country is designing, right, it should be mindful of this relationship. The country macroeconomic policy makers should know that any change in the exchange rate of their country would have a direct effect on their country's balance of payment value, right? So that is what we mean over here. Now, the first thing that we're about to discuss here is the relationship between internal and external currency. Okay, now that's the thing which we are about to discuss. Okay, now think about this. First of all, obviously, we'll define each of these terms, right? Because without defining these, we cannot understand the relationship exactly that exists, right? So, internal value of currency. What is that? Internal value of currency is the purchasing power. Let's write it down like this. Internal value of currency refers to the currency's purchasing power local goods and services, right? So that's what it means. Internal value of currency refers to the purchasing power, refers to currency's purchasing power in terms of local goods and services. For instance, how, for instance, what of goods and services $100 bill can buy in be internal. Is it making sense, Preet? Right? Now, what is internal value of currency? Internal value of currency is basically what dollars internal value of currency. Okay. Now, what is internal value of currency? Refers to the currency's purchasing power in terms of local goods and services. Now, this is something very important, right? Now, local goods and services. How many units of local or what quantity of local goods and services can a certain amount of a currency can buy? That is that currency's local value of currency, right? Or internal value of currency, right? So for instance, what quantity of goods and services $100 bill can buy in the US, right, would be dollars internal value of currency, right? Is it making sense? Then similarly, what is external value of currency, right? Now, external value of currency refers to currency's purchasing power in terms of other currencies. Now, does that ring any bell, right? So think about this. What have we, what do we know, or how do we define the term when we say that the purchasing power of one currency in terms of another currency, right? So if you recall, that was our definition of exchange rate. Because what is exchange rate? Exchange rate is simply that how many units of your currency do you need to buy 1 unit of another currency, right? So if Pakistan's exchange rate with US dollars right now is 172:1, that means that we need 172 units of Pakistani currency to buy 1 unit of dollars, and so on, right? So every currency in the world has an exchange rate with all the other currencies that are available. So we can have the exchange rate, we have the exchange rate of rupees against dollars, dollars against pounds, pounds against euros, euros against, I don't know, Bangladeshi taka, and so on and so forth, right? So external value of currency refers to currency's purchasing power in terms of other currencies, which is basically exchange rate, right? This is simple, which is basically called the exchange rate, right? Okay. Now, what is the relationship between internal and external value of currency? Now, think about this. Here comes in the main part. Currency decreases inflation in an economy. Okay. Now, think about this. This idea is fairly simple, and we are already aware of this fact that when there is higher inflation, which means that prices of local goods and services is increasing at a faster rate, then a certain amount of local currency will buy lesser goods. Let me write this down. Um, high inflation, prices of goods and services fast rate, and therefore certain amount of local currency now by quantities of goods and services, right? So this idea should be very obvious, being an economic student, that internal value of currency would decrease when there is higher inflation. Why? Because prices are increasing at a faster rate. Now just think about this. What $100 bill used to buy in US 5 years ago, right? For a fact, right now at this point in time, that $100 bill is buying much less quantity of goods and services in US what it used to buy 100 years ago. Why? Only one reason, that prices have increased over the years. There has inflation been in the economy during these years, right? So that's what I'm saying over here, that internal value of currency decreases due to inflation in an economy. During times of higher inflation, right? During times of higher inflation, um, rates, right? The price of goods and services are increasing at a faster rate, and therefore a certain amount of local currency, like $100, would buy low quantities of goods and services, right? So that's the simple idea. Now, this being said, how will this affect your and vice versa, right? And obviously, not every time prices are increasing at a faster rate. Sometimes prices are increasing at a slow rate. So when prices are increasing at a slow rate, or let's say there's deflation taking place, right? So when there's deflation taking place, it would be the opposite, right? So in the case of deflation, your internal value of currency would be increasing. Internal value of currency would be increasing because deflation means that prices are decreasing. When prices are decreasing, now the same quantity or the same amount of money would buy you more goods and services, right? Is this simple? Okay. Now, as far as this is concerned, and how will this affect your external value of currency, right? When products of the country are becoming expensive, would it be able to export more or less? Preet, what do you think? So when a country's inflation rate is high, which means its goods and services are becoming more expensive, then you tell me whether that country's demand for exports be higher or lower. Think about it. So if India's exchange rate is increasing at a faster rate, which means Indian products are becoming more expensive, then would India be able to export more or less? What do you think? It would be able to export less, right? Lower demand for Indian exports, right? On the other hand, higher inflation in an economy would mean countries' products are less competitive national markets, and therefore lower demand for the country's products, right? It's lower exports. Does it make sense? Right. Okay. Now, when the exchange rate, sorry, when the inflation rate in an economy is higher, that means that countries' products are more expensive relatively, and obviously other countries would demand less or buy less from that country, right? And therefore, the demand for exports for this main country that we're talking about would decrease. Simply speaking, if India, as I gave you the example, if India's inflation rate is higher, or if US inflation rate is higher, this means Indian or American products are becoming more expensive. Therefore, other countries who import their products are less likely to import from them or demand lesser quantity. Why? Because then they have other cheaper options. Why don't they import, let's say, from America if they can import that same product at a lower price from a European country or African country or whatever, right? So now think about this. What we learn out of this is that internal value, right? And when demand for exports is low, what happens to the demand for currency, right? Now, to understand this very last point, right? Now, the demand for currency, we do know that exchange rate, how our exchange rates determined. If you remember again, as I said, we will be discussing some concepts from the AS as well, because otherwise we cannot fully understand our topics of A2, right? How are exchange rates determined? So if you remember in AS, we talked about we talked about how exchange rates are determined. And the idea is fairly simple, right? So free floating exchange rates, right? There are different types of exchange rates, but we are talking about the mainstream, the most common type of exchange rate, which is free floating. And what's free floating? Free floating is how many free floating is when the government doesn't interfere with the exchange rate, right? And the government lets the exchange rate, the value of exchange rate to be determined through market forces, right? So government doesn't interfere in the values of exchange rate, and it's only the market forces that determine exchange rate, right? So what do we have on the y-axis? Dollar per pound, right? So how many dollars can each pound buy? That is what we have on the y-axis, right? And on the x-axis, you will obviously have what? On the x-axis, you will have quantity of pounds. What will you have? You will have quantity of pounds. So whichever of the two currencies on the, whichever of the two is the second currency on the y-axis, dollar per pound. So pound is the second currency in this case. So quantity of pounds will be on the x-axis. If we would have reversed this, right? So I'm just giving you a recap. If you want to reverse it, that how many pounds will each dollar buy? So now what is this statement saying? Pound per dollar. So then we would have quantity of dollars on the x-axis, right? So I mean, it's just the same. It's just the same thing. It's just that we're looking at from different perspective, right? Okay. Now think about this. Now, what do we need to add to this graph? So let's say we're looking at pound per dollar. How many pounds can each dollar buy? And we have quantity of dollars on the x-axis. So you will have demand and supply for dollars on this graph. You will have demand and supply of dollars on this graph, right? So downward sloping is the demand for dollars, upward sloping is supply for dollars. Now, wherever the two intersect, now wherever the demand supply intersect, that is your exchange rate value, right? So let's say each dollar buys 5 pounds, right? So that's what it shows, 5 pounds per dollar, right? So that is what it's showing us. Okay. Now, coming to the point. Now, when a country is exporting less because its products are becoming more expensive, other countries are not very much interested in buying from this country, what will that do? Which of the two will be affected? Preet, any guess, right? So building on the example that we were just discussing right now, that there's more inflation taking place in a country, which means its internal value of currency is decreasing. And due to that inflation, now the country's products are becoming more expensive, and therefore other countries are less interested in buying that country's products. Then how will that be shown on this graph? Then how lesser demand for exports for this country be shown on this graph? Let me tell you, right? So the idea is fairly simple, that when the demand for countries' exports is decreasing, its demand curve will shift to the left. Its demand curve will shift to the left like this, right? So from D1 to D2, right? So it shifts like this, and this is where the new equilibrium is. And this is where the new equilibrium is. And this shows that now each dollar has, the value of dollar against pound has depreciated, as we say, right? What do we say? That the value of dollar, or the exchange rate of dollars against pounds, has depreciated. And that's why you can see that now each dollar buys you less pounds. Instead of 5 pounds previously, it's only buying you 4 pounds now. Got it? So that's the entire thing that I'll write it down over here, right? So on the other hand, due to this, due to higher inflation in the economy, or you could have simply written this down as higher inflation in an economy would mean that a country products are less competitive on international markets, and therefore there would be for lower demand for the country's products, hence lower exports, right? Lower exports, for this currency decrease, therefore its exchange rate will depreciate against other currencies. A decrease, meaning a decrease in external. That is what it means, right? Is it simple? Breathe. Okay, now let's do a quick recap, right? Okay, and then we are done with this. Okay, think about this. So we were talking about the relationship between internal and external value of currency, right? Now, this was the thing, relationship between internal and external value of money, or as you can say, currency, right? Okay, now internal value of money or currency is basically how much is its purchasing power in terms of local goods, internal, within the country, right? So refers to currency's purchasing power in terms of local goods and services. So how many or what quantity of goods and services can a certain amount of local currency buy? That is its internal value of currency. Then what's the external value? External value of currency is how many units of another currency can your currency buy. So 1 rupee can buy, let's say 1 Indian rupee can buy how many takas, or 1 Indian rupee can buy how many euros or pounds. That is India's external value of currency, right? In terms of other currencies, not goods, but other currencies, right? Okay, now this being said, we said that internal value of currency is inversely related. I have to also quickly write this down. Internal value of currency is therefore inversely related to inflation rate. Simple and easy, right? So higher the country's inflation rate, lower would be the country's internal value of currency. We know this, right? Because it will be, then the currency would be buying fewer goods and services. Okay, now this being said, we know what external value of currency is now. With higher inflation, since your products are becoming less competitive on the world markets, and looking at the graph, we know that when the demand for your exports will be less, your demand for currency will shift to the left, and with that happening, your exchange rate value will depreciate. So therefore it means what? Lower the internal value of currency, lower would be your external value of currency, right? So the two things are going hand in hand. Hence, internal value of currency, or external value, right? Is it making sense, right? So higher inflation means your currency can buy fewer goods, right? Fewer quantity of local goods, then therefore your products are also less competitive on international markets. So you export less, the demand for your currency is less, and therefore your exchange rate depreciates, right? So external value of currency also decreases. So the two things are going in the same direction. Lower the internal value of currency, lower would be the external value of currency, and vice versa. Higher the internal value of currency, higher would be external value of currency. Any confusion, Preet, so far? Anything that's not clear? Right? Lower. Okay. Now, this being said, let's move to the next topic. Okay, perfect. Great. Now, the next one is also relatively simple. Relationship between balance of payments and inflation. Okay. Now, let's first come to the whiteboard over here and we'll quickly discuss relationship between balance of payments and um, relationship between balance of payment and inflation. Okay. Now, the idea is we know what is balance of payment, but we'll do a quick recap to, recall what it is. So balance of payment is an official document that all countries of the world maintain, in which they maintain a record of their exports and imports during a certain time period, right? So how many exports, what worth of exports and imports a country made during a certain time period, all of those are recorded in its balance of payment, right? And then if you remember, there were three accounts within balance of payment. So you have current account. We're not going in that detail. All of that was part of your AS, but just a quick recap. So current account used to record your trade in goods and services, which means exports and imports of goods as well as services. Then you had capital account. Capital account used to record, capital account records your sale and purchase of assets, right? And then you have financial account that records the investments, how investments flow between uh, how investment flows between different countries. If investment is coming in your country, that will be a credit transaction in your balance of payment. If investment is going out of your country, right, that would be recorded as a debit entry, right? So if exports are greater than imports in balance of payment, if exports, or money flowing in the country is greater than the money flowing out of the country. So let's put it down like this, right? So for balance of payment, if a country's exports are greater than its imports, or you can also think of it as cash flowing in or money flowing in the country. Like how will money flow in the country? Through more exports or through more investments. Cash flowing in the country is greater than the cash flowing out of the country, then it will be a surplus. Cash flowing out, cash flowing out of the country, right? So that will be a surplus. That's a surplus, right? And vice versa is a deficit, right? So vice versa is a deficit. Easy, we got on this? Okay. Now, this being said, we know how balance of payment works, basic idea. Now, the thing that we're about to discuss is relationship between inflation and balance of payments. Now, before I even explain you this, can you think that what will be the relationship, like knowing what inflation is and knowing what balance of payment is? Preet, can you tell me that what relationship do you expect? Do you expect a direct relationship? Direct relationship would be higher inflation and positive balance of payments. What do I mean when I say positive balance of payments? I mean a surplus. So when inflation is high, do you expect the balance of payment to go more in surplus? Or you expect the opposite, that when inflation is higher, you expect the balance of payment to go in deficit. So which of the two scenarios do you expect to exist, right? So relationship between inflation and balance of payments. Okay, now think about this, Pri. Let's try to break this argument down, right? So when your products, your country's products are becoming more expensive, right? That means that other countries, and that is what inflation is, right? So when your country products, when inflation is increasing, your country products are becoming more expensive for other countries' consumers. So they're less likely to buy your products. So the demand for your exports will decrease. Yes or no? And when the demand for your exports decreases, what happens? You'll export less. When you export less, obviously, as I just showed you, that your exports value decrease, and therefore your balance of payment is expected to be more in deficit rather than a surplus, right? So higher inflation means lower demand for exports, or simply speaking, lower exports. And when that happens, your country is is expected to go into deficit, right? So your deficit will rise. So that's the channel that exists, right? Is it making sense, right? So that's the simple idea. Why? Because your products are now less competitive, right? Everything else constant. So we are not saying that other factors don't affect your exports. They do affect, right? So it's not just about the price of the good. It's also about the quality of the products. It's also about the uniqueness of the product, right? So it's a couple of different, and also obviously most important of all, it also depends on the relationship, trading relationship between countries. But long story short, one major factor that affects, the demand for your exports is inflation. So if inflation is higher, lower would be your exports, and therefore higher would be the deficit, because exports will be relatively less compared to your imports. And also think about this. Why will your imports be higher? If Pakistan is experiencing more inflation, we did discuss right now that your exports would be less, but why would our imports be higher if local inflation is higher? The idea is simple, that now for me as a Pakistani consumer, it's more expensive to buy local goods, right? So Pakistani cars will be relatively more expensive. Pakistani clothes might be more expensive, and so on. And therefore, what I'll do instead is that I'll want to import cheaper products, right? So imports increase, exports decrease. Overall, your balance of payment is likely to go into a deficit, right? So that's the idea about it. Okay. Now, next thing that we were discussing here, relationship between inflation, right? Okay. Now, this goes like this, right? Okay. Now, the idea is inflation is higher, countries' products are becoming expensive and therefore less competitive, on international markets. Therefore, the demand for countries' products is expected to lower, hence and more imports, causing a of deficit. Got it? Right? So here's the thing. Relationship between inflation and balance of payments, right? If your country's products are more expensive, there would be less demand for your exports, you'll export less and you'll import more, because your consumers are also looking for cheaper options from other parts of the world. So they are more likely to import. And when they do that, so higher exports, lower imports, which means what? More cash is flowing out of the country than the cash that's coming in the country, right? What does this mean? So when you're importing more cash is flowing out of the country than the cash that is flowing in the country. So this drops, cash flowing in the country drops, cash flowing out of the country increases, and therefore that would result in a deficit, right? Okay, now that was the simple concept that we've just discussed, right? Okay, now next we have after this is trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Yeah, that's an important one. Okay, now what's the relationship between inflation and unemployment, right? Now we have separately discussed both variables. In fact, we know what both of these two variables are, like inflation and unemployment. But we are now about to look at is what's the relationship between the two. Okay, now the idea is inflation is the rise in the general price level, which shows how fast the country's products prices are increasing, and unemployment is that how many people are out of work, right? What number of people in a country are looking for job, they are eligible to work, they're actively looking for work, but they can't find a job. That's what unemployment is. Okay, now think about this. Now, this Phillips curve, right? So there was a New Zealand economist who, sometime back, I don't exactly know the date, but obviously in economics, you don't need to remember the dates. You just need to know the concept, right? A New Zealand economist who um, sometime, sometime back was intrigued relationship between inflation and unemployment. So what this economist did, I am about to explain you that he was interested in knowing the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So what he did, and in fact his name was Phillips, right? Right? That's why it's called Phillips curve, right? A New Zealand economist named Phillips sometime back was intrigued by the relationship between inflation and unemployment. So he did countries' inflation and unemployment statistics and plotted the graph. Think about this. The idea is fairly simple, uh, which is Phillips curve, right? So that's what Phillips curve is. Okay, have a look at this, students. Now, what we're discussing over here is that this economist called Phillips, right? He belonged to New Zealand, right? So what he did was he gathered the data, right? He collected actual data during the years, over the years, right, of countries' inflation and unemployment, right? So let's say in the past 10 years, what was India's inflation rate and how much was India's unemployment rate? Similarly, over the last 10 years, how much was Pakistan's inflation rate and how much was Pakistan's unemployment rate, and so on and so forth, right? Okay. Now, this being said, so when he started plotting the values, right? So when he started plotting the values, right, he observed this relationship that I'm about to explain you, right? So have a look at this. First, let's understand what's on the graph, right? On the y-axis, he kept inflation rates, right? Like inflation rate of 5% means that on average during a year, 5% was the increase in average price level, right? So this is positive. So on this side, obviously, it's positive inflation rate, which means, um, you know, prices are increasing. And then negative inflation rate, what is negative of inflation? That's deflation. So for the negative inflation rate, it would mean that prices are decreasing. And what we have on the x-axis is our unemployment rates, like how many people are out of work and what percentage of people are looking for work, unemployment rate, right? And so on. Okay, now let's have a look at this. The idea is that what he observed by plotting the values of the two variables, that there was a downward sloping, or a downward sloping curve like this, right? Let me draw like this. Okay. Now the idea is that what is this downward sloping curve showing us? This shows that there's inverse relationship between the two variables. There is an inverse relationship between two variables, which means higher unemployment means lower inflation and vice versa. Higher inflation means lower unemployment and vice versa, right? Okay, now the idea is, let's take some values over here. So let's say initially an economy was on point A, then it moved to point B, then it moved to point C, right? And so on and so forth, right? So on point A, let's look at specific values. So on point A, the inflation rate was, let's say, 5%. So inflation rate was 5%, right? And at this point, right, let's say 3% of the economy, 3% of the people were out of, just give me a second, please, just a second. So if inflation rate was higher, right, 5%, at this rate, how much is the unemployment? 3%, right? Now, when we move from point A, when this economy moved from point A to point B, right, what it shows that for an inflation rate of, let's say, 2%, right? How much is the unemployment in the economy? Let's say 7%, right? Then at this point C, the unemployment is 10% at an inflation rate of how much? At an inflation rate of 0%, like, which means that there was no increase in the prices during that time period. 0% inflation means 0% increase. So whatever the prices of goods and services was previously, same as the new price level. There has been no increase, no decrease. And similarly, if I choose a value over here, right? So that would mean that point D shows us that the inflation rate is negative, which means it's a deflation, meaning that the prices of the goods decrease during that time period. And therefore, right, let's say at this negative inflation rate of 3% or 3% deflation rate, there was an unemployment of 12%. Now let's try to, like, this was all about the mathematics part, right? It's all about looking at the values. But how does this make sense economically, right? In economic sense, let's talk about that. Now think about this. Breathe. You would remember in AS economics, we talked about causes of inflation. Now, what causes prices to rise in a country, right? So the one of those was demand pull inflation. The other one was cost push inflation. So demand pull and cost push, right? So demand pull inflation refers to the idea that when aggregate demand of a country is higher, right? When there's more demand for goods and services, higher would be the prices, right? Right? So this is the one that we'll focus on, right? Right? So Phillips curves looks at basically this type of inflation. There's also another type, but I'm just mentioning it for your, just to recap, but that's not what we are looking at the moment, cost push inflation. So cost push inflation is when the cost of production is increasing. And why is that increasing? Because the raw materials are, let's say, getting more expensive. The labor wages are increasing. The raw material is more expensive. The rent, electricity, and all these things are increasing in price. That's why it's resulting in higher cost of production, and therefore that higher cost of production is transferred into higher prices to consumers, right? Okay, but that is not what is shown on the Phillips curve. Instead, what is shown on the Phillips curve is demand pull inflation. Now, what was demand pull inflation? When aggregate demand of an economy is higher, which means that consumers are demanding more goods and services, then prices would be higher, right? Prices would be higher. Okay. Now, coming back to the idea. Now, what happens? Let's talk about this. Now, what happens when there's demand for inflation? Unemployment. When people are less out of work, when lesser number of people are out of work, that means what? On average on average income levels will be higher, right? Let me show you like this. When unemployment levels in an economy are lower, that means more people are working, right? When more people are working, that means average income levels are higher, right? Average income levels are higher because more people are working, they will be earning something, so they have incomes to spend, right? So they have more purchasing power, higher income levels, right? So when that is high, that means their purchasing power is higher. When purchasing power is high, that means they will be spending more on goods and services. They'll be buying more goods and services. With all of this happening, right? What will it do? Right? It will result in demand pull inflation. It would result in what? Higher aggregate demand, and higher aggregate demand would mean higher inflation. Higher aggregate demand would mean higher inflation. Is this making sense? So this is basically the entire process that explains that why higher unemployment would result in, lower unemployment would result in higher inflation, lower unemployment. Please just give me a second. I need to quickly connect my laptop to charging. Just give me a second. Okay, Preet, does it make sense? So let's look at this one more time. So we're talking about Phillips curve. What did I say? Phillips curve is a graph that was made by an economist called Phillips. And he was interested in looking at the relationship between inflation rate and unemployment, right? And what he discovered, what he did actually was he gathered actual data, historical data, as we say. And what's historical data? Actual data over the years, right? So if for India or Pakistan or any other country, I gather data over the last 10 years, or 20 years, 25 years, to see what were the inflation rates in those economies during that time period, and how much was the unemployment rate during that, during those certain time periods, right? So what you observed was a downward sloping curve, which means inverse relationship, which means what? Higher the unemployment, lower the inflation, lower the unemployment, higher the inflation, right? Now, we just explained how the two variables are connected, right? So if there is lower unemployment rate, this means most people are working, they have jobs, they're working, they're earning something, right? Which you can think of before COVID, right? Before COVID, unemployment rates were usually lower in countries. Every country was doing more or less fine. They had high economic growth rates and all that. So the average incomes of the citizens in those countries was higher, which means their purchasing power was higher, which means they were spending more, aggregate demand was higher, and therefore demand pull inflation, as we just discussed, is that when there's higher aggregate demand, there would be higher inflation. So that is what explains the entire process, that unemployment would have inverse relationship with inflation, and vice versa. You can just reverse this entire cycle. So when unemployment would be higher, right, your average incomes would be lower, right? Average incomes would be lower, your purchasing power would be lower, your aggregate demand would be lower, and therefore, as the result, your inflation would be low. Is it making sense, Preet? Okay, so please, we'll stop here for today. There's a meeting that I have to, excuse me. There's a meeting that I have to attend. Tomorrow we'll have a longer session, right? So tomorrow we can start our class by around 7, and then we can take it till 8:30, right? So we'll stop here for today. Tomorrow I'll write down all the definitions that we have discussed and all the Phillips curve thing, right? And then hopefully, let me quickly show you, right? So then we are done. Tomorrow we'll do this remaining part of the Phillips curve, and then just, few more points to cover, 3 more points to cover, right? Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow then. Okay, thank you so much. Take care. Have a good night. Bye.